Hello, fourth year students. Today we are going to talk about the topic number 5 in our syllabus for this year on language testing and assessment. The topic number 5 is entitled Communicative Test Design. So in the previous topics, we were having some introduction about testing in general. Okay, what is testing? What are the related terms to the term test in our field? Then we talked about the approaches to language testing, the different types of testing, the features of a good test. All these topics were talking about the testing in general or language testing in general. From this topic, we are going to start talking about the communicative test. Okay, which is the main important type of test that we have to know everything about it because it is the only type that is nowadays used in our schools. So as teachers of a foreign language, of English as a foreign language, you have to be aware of every detail related to designing, making, and rating, constructing, monitoring, developing this type of test. So first of all, we are going to start with comparing between the traditional types of tests and the communicative test. So traditional types of tests were mainly aiming at what? They were aiming at checking or measuring or testing the students' knowledge in particular subjects. So if we are talking about our language test, about our field, language is a language test, we can understand that all the tests and the approaches that came before the communicative approach in teaching the foreign language were mainly based on checking the knowledge that the students have after being taught certain topics in the language. Okay, so for instance, in a certain course which lasted for a certain period of time, I taught my students things related to grammar, such as about tenses, prepositions, articles, and so on. So at the end of this course, as a teacher, I am supposed to to make a test for my students to check their knowledge. Do they know these items, these grammatical items that I already explained for them in the course or not? So what am I going to use? I am going to use a kind of questions or format or tasks that were mainly, okay, or that are mainly what aiming at checking whether my students know them or not. Like what? Like the multiple choice item, the true false item, making sentences, for example, exemplification, and so on. Okay, so here this was the aim of the traditional types of language test. Then Brown in 2003 states that by the mid-1980s, the language testing field had begun to focus on designing communicative language testing tasks. So you see, starting from the from the mid of 80s, a new approach in language testing had appeared, and it appeared as a result of what? Of the appearance of or the emergence of the communicative approach in teaching the foreign languages. So here, this means that we are in need for what? For communicative language test. Okay, that's why so much research has been done on how to design and develop communicative language test. So the communicative test has a different aim, okay, from the traditional test. If you remember, we said that the traditional test was aiming at what? Only measuring the knowledge of our students concerning certain topics that they were taught. Is it clear? But when we come to the communicative test, we are going to see that it has a different aim, which is that to measure the communicative competence of the learners or of the students and not the knowledge. Okay, so in order to now know what is the communicative competence, we can now refer to Cannell and Swain in 1980 when they say that the communicative competence in fact involves four important elements. There we can find within the communicative competence the linguistic competence, which means that the knowledge of the linguistic forms, okay? The sociolinguistic competence, the ability to use language appropriately in context. The discourse competence, which includes coherence and cohesion. And strategic uh, competence, which refers to the knowledge of verbal and non-verbal communicative strategies. Okay, so you see, the communicative competence involves these elements. The communicative competence is talking about something bigger than only the knowledge. Knowledge is only one component, you see, of the communicative competence. So within the communicative competence, first of all, the student should know the structure, okay? So that should know about the linguistic structure or of the language element that he has to use in a certain situation. So you see here we are talking about using, and this will lead us to talk about the second type of competence, which is sociolinguistic competence. It is not enough that our students know the grammatical structures of tenses, for instance, okay? But they have to incorporate this with using, to involve this knowledge in certain meaningful situations, in realistic situations, in order to be able to use them, or to employ the knowledge that they have about language in real life communication. Also, there should be discourse competence. And here we are referring to coherence and cohesion. And they are both found in the two types of communication, the spoken and the written communication. When we speak or when we write, our speech or our communication in both types, in the spoken and the written, should have coherence, should be related, okay? And should have also cohesion. They should have unity. The ideas that we are producing should be related with each other throughout using certain linguistic elements that connect them, okay? Then there is strategic competence. And this means that the knowledge of the verbal and non-verbal communicative strategies. We know that when we communicate with each other, we are not only depending on words, but sometimes we need to understand the body language, the facial expressions of the speaker in order to understand what he or she wants to say. So here, the last type or the last component of the communicative competence deals with with both the verbal and the non-verbal strategies of communication. So you see, this is the aim of the communicative test. The communicative test aims at measuring all these types of competencies that the foreign student, the foreign language learner, or the foreign language students has to have in order to be a fluent and a professional speaker of the language. Okay, so before we talk about the stages of making or designing an effective communicative test, in fact, we need to know two things about the communicative test. First, we need to know about the principles of designing. What should we do, okay, in order to design an effective communicative test, okay? Then we have to know about the features the important features or characteristics of an effective or a good communicative test. So if we start with the principles, we see here they are four. Number one, start from somewhere. And here, this point or this item talks about what the objectives. As a teacher, when you want to construct or make or design a communicative test for your students, what is the objective? What is your objective? What is the element or the ability or the skill that you want to measure, okay, from this test? So first of all, you have to do what? You have to decide your objective. Second, concentration on content. Okay, after deciding or delimiting or determining your objectives, you have now to what? To set or to decide on which items, which skills, which abilities that you are going, which tasks you are going to include in your test. Here we are talking about what? About the content. And remember, we said that the content of the test is related to what? To one of the important features of the test, which is validity. Here, if you remember, we talked about content validity. And within content validity, we said that the content that you are going to include or the task that you are going to include in your test should reflect what? Should reflect the content or the topics that you have already taught to your students. Okay? Second, these the contents or tasks that you are going to include in your test should be, because here we are talking about a different type of test, which is the communicative test. They experts here, they focus or emphasize the importance that they should match the needs of the learners. So the learners, we know that learners are of different levels and ages. Okay, and of course in each age our needs from learning of learning the language are going to be what? Different. Okay, so when we are teaching children, the needs of the children in using the language for the purpose of the communication outside the classroom and their real life situations are going to be different from the needs of adults. Okay, this means that the content of or the topics that we are going to teach for children are going to be different from the topics we are teaching for what? For adults. Okay, and consequently the contents that we are going to include and the tasks that we are going to include in our test are going to be different also according to what? To the age and needs of our learners. Okay, number three, bias for best. What does this mean? It means that you as a test creator, which means the teacher, you have to make the test, okay, exploit test takers' performance at their best. What does this mean? It means that the task that you are going to involve or to include in your test should be what? Comprehensible, understandable by what? By the test takers, by your students, by your learners. Otherwise they will not understand it. If the contents, if the questions, the formats of the question, the formats of the task that you are going to include in your test are ambiguous, are not understandable enough, are incomprehensible, so how could your learners and how could the testees understand what they should to do in order to what? To perform correctly in what? In doing or conducting the test. Is it clear? So here the number 4 talks about that the task that or the students should be familiar, okay, with the formats of the task, with the type of the task that you are including in your test in order to be able to perform appropriately and effectively. Number 4, working on washback. Okay, if you remember, we talked about this about washback as one of the important features of language testing. And by the way, it is either called washback or backwash. Okay, so what is washback? In order to remind you of the definition of this term, if you remember, we said that it is the effect of the test on the teaching process, a teaching and learning process. And this effect can either be, if you remember, we say positive or negative. So here we want our communicative test to have what? A positive effect on or impact on what? On our teaching and our teaching and learning method or process. Is it clear? So how could we do that? Here we have, as teachers and as learners, think of the objectives of the course. Is it clear? We should not come to the course in order to learn for what? Having a test only, for passing the test. This is a negative effect. But if we want to learn, okay, effectively, appropriately, we have to think of what? Of implementing or achieving the objectives of the course. So what are the objectives of the course? What are the elements that, or the things that as a teacher I should make sure that my students have really learned or acquired from my course? Is it clear? I am going to what? To include them in my test in the form of a task. Is it clear? In order to what? In order to give them a chance, in order to give my students a chance to practice these elements or these topics that they have really learned in my course, to reflect that they really learned something from the course I taught them. So what should we think about when we talk about washback? A positive washback, we have to think about what? The objectives, okay, of the course, the contents of the course, the appropriate types of the situations, okay, that we are going to include in our test so that our students will communicate appropriately and effectively. In this way, I'm going to, as a teacher, have what? A positive washback from my test on what? On my teaching method, okay, or as a teacher, and on the learning behavior of my students. Then we have what? Characteristics. What are the characteristics of a good communicative language test? According to Brown in 2005, there are 5 requirements for setting up a communicative test. What are these 5 requirements or characteristics or features? Number 1, meaningful communication. 2, authentic situation. 3, unpredictable language input. 4, creative language output. And 5, integrated language skills. So these are the features of the good communicative test. If we start with the meaningful communication, what does it mean? It means that the tasks that you are going to include in your test should lead to what? To make the students have meaningful communication. Should lead the students to communicate with each other about what? About authentic situation. Is it clear? So you see, these two, the first 2 features are related to each other. How can I make my students understand what they were talking or communicating about or writing about? Of course, I should put them in what? In an authentic situation. And you remember what we said about authenticity. Authenticity means that when you are talking about real life situations, okay? Not artificial situations. Not take individual sentences out of context and put them in your test. No. To use authentic situations in your test so as your students are going to what? To communicate in a meaningful way about these situations. They can understand the forms of the language that they have to talk about a certain situation because they already, this situation that you include in your test can be similar to some situation that they may encounter in their own life, real life. Okay? Then, features number 3 and 4, unpredictable language input and creative language output. What does this mean? So usually in communication we have what? We have input and output, such as we have a question and answer. Okay, you ask a question, so this is an input, and you expect an answer. This is what? This is an output. So why is the input unpredictable? Because usually in real life situations, when we talk with each other, when we communicate with each other in any ways, in any form of communication, whether it is spoken or written, we cannot predict what the other people are going to say. Okay, this is a natural way of how people communicate with each other in real life situations. Is it clear? So this is the correct way of making a meaningful and authentic situation to include in your test. It should it should lead the students to use language naturally. Is it clear? It is different from, if you remember, memorization of dialogues. In the past, we were taught in this way. There are dialogues in the textbook, and we have to memorize it. This is not an authentic situation. Okay, this is what memorization. You teach your students what to say. That this is what you have to say in this, and this is how you answer this. This is such a question. Okay, this is not a real life situation. This is not authenticity. This is not a communicative test. But when you tell your students, imagine that you are in this situation, what you are going to say. Okay, or someone is asking you this question, what are you going to answer? You see, here your student is going to imagine, is going to predict, is going to let us say imagine that he is to put himself or herself in this situation, which is really taken from a real life of a normal person, and he has to what? To answer naturally, to answer according to his own or her own features of personality and life. Is it clear? The same thing of creative language output. Ask your students questions about their life situations, their real life situations, and wait for their answers. Don't tell them how to answer. No, let them answer by themselves. This is a creative language output. Then we have number 5, integrated language skills. Integrated language skills. What does it mean? It means that in a meaningful and authentic real life situation, we usually use more than one skill in communicating with people. Okay, and for instance, in conversation we use listening and speaking. Okay, and in writing and email we use both reading and writing. So here you see here we are using more than one skill in real life situations. So the same thing here in your test. You have to include tasks that requires from your students to use more than one skill. Why? In order to make your test communicative, and communicative means that you should the communication you are going to depend on is meaningful and is based on authentic situation. Okay, so in this video we have talked about what is the difference between the traditional language test and the communicative test. Okay, then we talked about the features, the principles. First of all, the principles and the features of the language test. The most important thing, the most important point, which is that how can communicative language ability be measured effectively? And this is going to be done in what? In 4 stages. I'm going to talk about these stages in another video in order not to make this video too long for you. Okay? Thank you. Stay safe, please.